We come to the 11th presentation in this set of 13. And before we get into the presentation proper, I wanted to alert you to a special page which I have prepared, which is the correct harmonic for the classic Hermetica, which were written between 90 and 110 AD in Alexandria, and are one of the most important harmonic sets of spiritual treatises in history. The Hermetica use the same kind of Greek sophisticated language that St. John uses in his Gospel and in the book of Revelations. It is a sophisticated, it's called New Testament Greek, but it is a Greek which has been raised several orders rapidly in its expressive complexity and its kaleidoscopic fluidness. It would be akin to taking the English of medieval times and within one generation running it up to the Middle English of Chaucer, and with the next generation of running Chaucer's English up to Shakespeare, and then in the third generation from that running the language from Shakespeare up to Romantic poets like Shelley, and then in the fourth generation running that up to the language of Yeats and so forth, all within a single time frame of about 100 years. So it's a big compression. The Hermetica number 14, and the classical set was always 13, but there was a lost treatise, so that the third treatise was supplanted by a part of the second treatise that was made something separate and was only a paragraph. Fortunately, the Nag Hammadi discoveries in Egypt on the Nile River in 1945, when they were finally put together in translation, and the editing was done under the aegis of James M. Robinson at the Institute of Antiquity and Christianity in Claremont, out near Pomona, California. And in the Nag Hammadi material, there were 7 books of collections of tractates that were buried around 360 AD because the Christianity of the day had become the formal religion of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire brooked no competition for their style of structure, and so the material was buried. Nag Hammadi is where there is a big curling arc of the Nile River. And down at the bottom of the arc is where you would find Thebes and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Bahri, built by Hatshepsut. And at the top of it, you would find Abydos, which is the original first and second dynasty capital and sacred center of ancient Egypt, going back about 3,000 years. The Hermetica, in their originality, present a compression not only of the sophistication of the Greek language, but taking the entire tradition of the Greek language and compressing 1,000 years, a whole millennium, into one jewel-like, scintillating presentation of wisdom, which has its cognates all over the world at the time. The 1,000 years is the Homeric Greek, brought 500 years later into a huge complexity with philosophers like Pythagoras, and then that brought into a further compression and complexity by Plato and Aristotle, and then finally brought to the quality that one finds in what is called in philosophy the Middle Platonists. All of this compression, all of this complexity is not a cramming down, but it is a recutting of the prism of the person to become jewel-like. And so in the Alexandrian tradition of about 100 AD, it was referred to as the way of perfection. And the central protagonist in this was a pair, Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And it was their pairedness that generated a sharedness that was shareable. And so the Hermetica exhibit the steps in resonance by which one constructs the harmonic of guidance to bring yourself into the amphitheater of wisdom, as they used to say, whereby you can perfect yourself. And the cognate in India was the development of the Mahayana. The cognate in China at the time was the development of a philosophical Taoism that is exemplified in a book called the Huainanzi. And the Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Indian, China, far Celtic, West, all of this at the very same time is like a threshold of wisdom, which then was developed esoterically in many of these areas, but increasingly several centuries later fell into needing to be secret and not just esoteric. Something is esoteric because it takes a sophistication to be able to know what it is. Something is secret because you're hiding it for fear of prosecution and persecution, death and dismemberment. So the list of the Hermetica I have restored back to the way it was some 1,800 years ago, so that you can now consult it. The Nag Hammadi text was actually called the Sacred Sermon. In the Nag Hammadi, it's called the 8th reveals the 9th. And by this, you'll understand in the presentation, this is referring to dimensions. And the little prayer that goes with it in the Nag Hammadi is called the Prayer of Thanksgiving. You'll find in the Dead Sea Scrolls a whole collection of Thanksgiving prayers called the Hodeo by the Teacher of Righteousness. And in the Hermetica, at the coda conclusion of many of the treatises, there's a sacred prayer. The first treatise is the Poimandres, the creative mind shepherd, who is Jesus. And the 13th is the rebirth. And then the 14th is the great Asclepios, or the perfect sermon on the Mount. The 8th reveals the 9th is the sacred Sermon on the Mount. And the 2nd is the general Sermon on the Mount. And the cognate reference here is to the Gospel according to Matthew, which after the stylization of the periodicity of Jesus, these are the generations of Jesus, from Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the exile, 14 generations. From the exile to Jesus, 14 generations, making 42. So the 14 is the beginning, like the Abraham to the David set. And the total of all of the Hermetic treatises was, of course, 42. We know it's 42 because Clement of Alexandria, who was one of the great geniuses towards the end of the 2nd century AD in Alexandria, his mentor and teacher was the man who founded what was called the catechetical school in Alexandria, preparing people to not become part of a church, but preparing people to be able to appreciate the way of Jesus. The way was, of course, the Great Way. In India, it was called the Mahayana. In Alexandria, it was called the Way of the Thrice Greatest Guide of Wisdom, Hermes Trismegistus. All of this is to say that we're looking at, especially today, a tripartite, a trinity, a triad of stages by which our species has occurred. And it's extremely important to understand what that triad is. Our original species was Homo sapiens and came into being in Africa by a single woman. There was an Eve who had a genetic mutation from the previous Homo species, hominid species, Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis. Our species goes back several million years. But the 200,000 years ago mutation, this woman is the first parent of our entire species. And for about 160,000 years, Homo sapiens went in the natural pattern that occurs with species, following the cycles of nature. That nature as a field out of which existence not only occurs, but keeps occurring because it's fertile, out of which space expands its capacity, time continues in its cycles, and that eventually nature generates a phase, field, out of which a form of existence occurs, and because it's iterative, not static, it occurs in terms of time leading the space of form. So that time is the binder, it's the common denominator of the 3 dimensions of space. And the mind turns this upside down and conceives of it as space-time, whereas in the existentiality of it, it's really a time-space. All existentials are time-bound, including the cycles of time itself. This is extremely important to understand. This is why the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, is mentioned, begins with, these are the generations of Jesus. And they occur in exactly this kind of a rhythm. But the rhythm, though it is distributed consistently by generations, 14, 14, 14, the first 14, when you puzzle it out in terms of Moses' Genesis, turns out to be 1,000 years. It is the first codification then of a millennium. From Abraham to David is a millennium. The second millennium from David to Jesus is split into 2 500-year cycles. And because they're presented as a form, one has a 2,000-year form, the Greek term for that was an aeon, which has a pair of 1,000-year forms, which are millennia, and each millennia has a pair of 500-year forms called cycles of the phoenix. And in this, one can begin to understand that if you take a string that vibrates and you put a finger in the middle, you now have the vibration of the string split into pairs. And if you do the same thing again, now you have 3 nodes within that string, and you begin to have that vibration portioned out. And if you do it one more time, a third time, you will have a string that has an octave of sound. With that octave of sound, one can now compose an infinite variety of music and further come to understand, eventually, thousands of years later, that there are an infinite number of musical scales. So there is endless music that can be composed and heard, appreciated in every scale of an infinite scale. It is a combination of multiplication going into higher orders of infinity. All of this is just to tune us, as it were, to acclimate us to the fact that the original hominid transform mutation of Homo sapiens, about 1/4 of the time back, 3/4 of the time that it began, went through a second mutation, a second transformation. And that second transformation is critical in the sense that it is identifiable, it is recognizable because of the development of art. For the first time, one begins to have cave art. Paintings on the walls of caves, sculptures within those caves, and the caves themselves are arranged so that the sculptures and the paintings are in a presentational order in terms of the time that it takes to walk through that space. And because these spaces are always dark, it's not just night, it is the under earth. The only way to go through at that time was with the invention of the little clay cups that had a hole that could be filled with animal fat and were like early lanterns. And by the light of those lanterns, the light gives off a glow, and there is only a limited area of the cave that is lit well enough to see form. But if you're in a cave that is permanently, totally dark, any kind of a flame whatsoever gives an extraordinary illumination to it. Not enough to see, but enough to understand that there is a radiance everywhere in the cave. If you've never been in a cave in the complete darkness, if you light a single match, it flares like a jet engine. And the illumination of the entire cave becomes a mystery which is radiated not just by the peripheral light by which one is seeing, but by the physiological and neurological certainty that you can see beyond where the eyes can see. When I was about 8 years old, my parents took me to Carlsbad Caverns, and we rode the elevator way down to the bottom, and they turned all the lights in Carlsbad Caverns off, and then a ranger would shine one little flashlight, and the amplitude of the big room in Carlsbad Caverns would just impress you with this great mystery that somehow there was a way to sense, a way to perceive that was not limited to the body, was not limited to perception or even to conception, but that there was a visionary penumbra, as it were. And so cave art, the paintings and the sculptures, seen in this way, were radiantly revelatory to the visionary dimension that time and space had a fifth dimension of visionary approach. And out of this visionary approach came the ability to see in one's mind not just the images as representations of existential objects, but to see images in a transparency where they were coming from the visionary radiance and not from the existential source. The mind then becomes bifocal, learns progressively that one can have a pair of reference for any kind of imagery, that one can have a referent back to things, back to the ritual actions which we do, but it can also have a forward referent to the visionary capacity. And in this way, consciousness is a fifth dimension. But it initiates something which is extraordinary, and this is where Homo sapiens became capable of a refined subspecies. And the classic way to talk about it is to double, to multiply the word sapiens, which means wisdom. So that the refined species became Homo sapiens sapiens. Wise man, wise about being wise. And Homo sapiens sapiens made art forms out of the visionary field, but did not understand immediately that it was not just a transform of space-time, not just a transform of the way in which existence is perceived, and that the referentiality to existence has a meaning which is conceived, and that in between the mind which structures the conception and the body which does the sense perception is the whole range of experience. And that this experience is like a horizon of the world. It's the horizon of the world of experience, and that it is carried by images which have feeling tones that are associative with them. And that there is a way to modify the kind of language that previous hominid species had, which was extraordinarily limited. But Homo sapiens had the ability, for instance, just to speak like I am speaking. You have to have not only a physiological capacity to modify your breath about 60 times per second, but you have to have a kind of a thoracic neural ganglia complexity in your spinal column to be able to handle the speed and the variation and the flexibility of that. And so Homo sapiens have an evolutionary sophistication. But Homo sapiens sapiens multiplied that manyfold. 200,000 years for Homo sapiens, 40,000 years for Homo sapiens sapiens, and about 5,000 years ago there began to be a second transformation. And that second transformation, about 3000 BC, occurs everywhere in the world that we can look at and trace back in some kind of a continuity. In Egypt, it's the beginning of dynastic Egypt. In India, it's the time of the Mahabharata, the Great Indian War. In China, it's the development of the I Ching from its origins of the Bagua, the 8 trigrams of Fuxi and New Gua. In Ireland, it's the building of New Grange. In Mesopotamia, it's the beginning of the sophistication of the Sumerian cities into groupings of cities that somehow became larger kingdoms than just the city centers. All of that is a quality which is the seed and the beginning of a third level of our hominid species, Homo sapiens stellaris. Not just wise about being wise, but wise about the star context which is within reach of the original visionary field, so that by the time that that occurs, one has not just a development of visionary consciousness as a 5th dimension, and the 6th dimension of the art, the artist who is originally a seer, visionary, a seer, who now becomes an artist because they know how to create out of that visionary field from images and feelings and aspects of language that were not there in the natural cycle. Homo sapiens sapiens considered it a transformation of nature. One speaks of the alchemy refining lumen de natura to lumen de lumen, from natural light to the light of lights. Vision and art were, for about 35,000 years, exclusively transformations applied to the natural cycle. But 5,000 years ago, with the beginning, again, of very few people, hardly anyone at all, for a very long time, more than 2,000 years, there probably were not much more than just a few handfuls of people. The second transform is no longer a transformation, but is what is called in chemistry a distillation. And that distillation includes making then the second cycle not a cycle, but an ecology. And so the whole understanding now that there are a pair of dimensional quartets. The first is a frame of reference, which is a cycle of nature and integrals. The second is turning at 90 degrees, so instead of a frame of reference, one has a diamond of insight. The frame of reference I call a square of attention, because one doesn't look at the frame immediately, one looks at the composition of the picture, what it looks like. The same thing with the diamond of insight. It isn't apparent at first what one is looking at, that one is looking through a jewel and not a frame. And it takes quite a long time, many thousands of years, for even the capacity of the new refinement of species to be able to be appreciated and then analyzed. Because the second transform is a transform of science. The first transform is truly a transform, that of art, but the second is a distillation of science. And just as the field of vision gives the dimensional context for the 6-dimensional forms of art, the spiritual person is a work of art. The painting brought out of a visionary field, a work of art. The music, the architecture. But science comes out of a kaleidoscopic conscious flow, which is what true history is all about. And true history reveals that if one follows the incredible detail of this, it is not integral but differential. It not only opens up, it opens up, opening up. So that one now has a different kind of approach to what a life is, what a community is, what a culture is, what a civilization can be. About 300 years ago, we received a genius jump in capacity to analyze. It was the first time that the reversibility paired of the ecology of consciousness was able to be expressed in a language, the symbolic language of mathematics. And as usual in the way in which history unfolds, there are not just one instance of this, but quite frequently it's paired. The two figures about 300 years ago who made the mathematical language of distillation to understand that the ecology of consciousness in a stellar amplification, that is to say, what we are and what we do, is harmonically related to what the cosmos does, what the universe as not just a universe, but as a multiverse, an omniverse, a cosmos, that one can approach it going either way, and if you pair those two ways together, you get a complementarity that allows for you to have a multidimensional appreciation and analytic that can be further developed. The two people 300 years ago were Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz. Leibniz on the continent in Germany and Newton in England. Had there not been a glitch in history, they would have been confrères. They would have both been in England, because the patron for Leibniz became George I. The House of Hanover took over the English throne. But Leibniz was left behind because he had just merely been the tutor of the wife and daughter of George I. And George didn't want to have the tutor of his wife and daughter having such a big, conspicuous place, so he was left on the continent, left in Germany. And almost all of his writings, more than 90%, have never been translated. They're still in one of the royal libraries in Germany, unread and untranslated, because real learning is a dangerous thing. You cannot continue tyrannies or wars or neurotic or even psychotic madnesses anymore when you know how to get well. This is how to heal. We got a jump start 100 years ago because the understanding that was there originally with Newton and Leibniz received a tremendous complication about 150 years ago. Two other individuals came along, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and developed the theory of evolution. The development of the way in which the patterning of life, not just for our species, but for any and all species, going back to the very origins of organic emergence. And not only on this planet, but on any planet. Not only in this star system, but any star system. Not only in this galaxy, but any galaxy. We have an analytic capacity in 21st century astrophysics to be able to tell if there are black holes in the center of a galaxy out to about 50 galaxies, but there are billions of galaxies that we can identify. 2 days ago, a mission was launched not from Cape Kennedy, but from the military arm of Cape Kennedy called Cape Canaveral. And that launch was the Kepler satellite, which does not go into orbit around Earth, but goes into a sliding harmonic orbit that slips away and stays in the Earth's orbit around our star. And it follows the same kind of computing program that we used several years ago for the Spitzer Space Telescope. It doesn't, like Hubble, just go up and be 1,000 miles away, but increasingly the Spitzer Telescope now is 62 million miles away from Earth in the Earth's orbit around our star, and Kepler will follow it. What Kepler is made to do is to survey 100,000 stars simultaneously for signs, astrophysically, of water, of atmosphere, of the ingredients for life. And when it's up and running, after the testing of it goes through about a year's cycle, we will be able to tell probabilities of how many Earths are out there. Homo sapiens stellaris refrain from calling it Earth. We use the terms Terra. We don't call it the moon. There are many moons. It's Luna. And so a whole new nomenclature comes into play, and that nomenclature is not just in the old grammar, but in what Noam Chomsky called in his epical book in the 60s, a transformational grammar. One has to learn how to complexify a rhetorical, referential description into a poetic, jewel-like scintillation of a range of meaning, which requires an artist to deal with and improves through critique, and is able to communicate in a harmonic with scientists who use a very high Dharma poetic language, because the spread of their spectra, each aspect of it has a spectra of itself. The great bifocal procedure of Newton and Leibniz was called calculus, and that in between 0 and 1, there are an infinite number of steps, and you can exactly determine how much of what you are analyzing and looking at, and the same moving from 1 back to 0, so that there's an integral calculus and a differential calculus, and that the two together allow for literally a starburst of mathematics. It's like a slow explosion. It took a couple of 100 years for it to really go beyond the reach of where anyone could have imagined that it would go. There are more books published on math now in every year than have been published totally in the history of mankind. Is exponential radiance. Can no longer be called an explosion. It's the kind of light that you get when you light up the darkness of unknowing. It isn't that you see everything all at once, but you see that you can learn to see. Let's take a break. Let's come back. You're looking at the cover of Stephen Jay Gould's last great book. He died of complications a couple of years ago. This is the Structure of Evolutionary Theory, and it is a tome of nearly 1,500 pages. Gould is an extraordinary character. He's what in my great work on Hermetic America is called a Hermetic American. And next week we'll take a closer look, because Gould and a very good friend of his, Niles Eldredge, who is the head of the Natural History Museum, developed the theory of punctuated equilibrium about 35 years ago. And one of the great things about Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge is that with a third person, a woman named Elizabeth Verba, were the three musketeers when they were young in going into evolutionary studies. And the structure of evolutionary theory for Niles Eldredge and Elizabeth Verba: may we always be the three musketeers, prevailing with panache, from our manic and scrappy inception at Dijon to our non-satanic and happy reception at doomsday, all for one and one for all. And then the structure of evolutionary theory has a frontispiece of the complexity and monstrosity when people try to do patchwork. Patchwork, when put into quilts, can be folk art, but patchwork in terms of theory is always a chimera. When Gould died, a special supplement to paleobiology was put out as a little booklet, Macro Evolution. Macro is the larger scale of evolution. Diversity, Disparity, Contingency, Essays in Honor of Stephen Jay Gould, edited by two of his musketeers. We have used this book in our learning civilization education when it came to the science phase, the 8th phase. We're going to work next week with Stephen Jay Gould and the development of sophistications. His Structure of Evolutionary Theory is published by Harvard 2002. And we're going to use as an angle of insight Symbiotic Planet by Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis was the first wife of Carl Sagan, and their children, the oldest son, Dorian Sagan, has done a number of books with his mother. She teaches at Amherst College in Massachusetts, the place that Emily Dickinson lived in for most of her life. And we're going to take a look at Symbiotic Planet and the Structure of Evolutionary Theory and some of Niles Eldredge's works. We're going to try to look at the way in which species and individuals within the species are layers, and that these layers have not only a resonance, but have a magnetic resonance, as well as an electromagnetic iteration. The iterative quality in an integral natural cycle will always have an electromagnetic energy frequency in its modulations and proportions. But that electromagnetic energy in its frequency has a complement that seems undetectable, and on the integral level, on the level of Homo sapiens, or even Homo sapiens sapiens, it is not detectable because the complement to it is a magnetoelectric energy. And its frequency is about 20 billion times what the electromagnetic energy is. The carrier of electromagnetic energy is the photon. The carrier of magnetoelectric energy is not named, and not named for very good reason. It is an infinite non-form of 11 dimensions. And those 11 dimensions do not register at all in either the integral or the differential, except by inference. Let's review. The 4 dimensions of the integral have been known for a very long time, space-time. The 4 dimensions of the differential ecology, when they are jeweled out by the development of wisdom, not the raising of consciousness so much, but the differential, not differentiation. Differentiation and variation are aspects of the integral cycle. A differential works the other way. One cycle works in a clockwise motion, the other works in a counterclockwise motion. So that when the original poiesis, I have to use the Greek term because it was the classical Greeks that first discovered this. When the original poiesis happened, it happened because there came a generation who were able to be guided in a more complete way, and the central figure in that was Pythagoras. The generation after Pythagoras, he lived to be 99, so he was still alive. He studied for 56 years. He began when he was 22, so he was in his late 70s before he began to really set up powerful Pythagorean mystical communities in the south of Italy, around the Bay of Tarentum. That first generation included a number of genius people, 2 of which are extremely important for us. One of them was the mystical pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides. The other was a woman, and her name was Diotima of Mantinea. Mantinea is in the southern Peloponnese, but the northern part of it up near the Gulf of Corinth. If you read Plato's dialogue, The Symposium, his differential conscious teacher was Diotima of Mantinea. He learned something that was not teachable by other people, and she got it direct as one of that first generation. She was a contemporary of Parmenides. So that if you will read Plato's Symposium, you will see that she taught Socrates about love, that love is a spirit, that it is not a desire, it is certainly not a referential exclusively to the body, to the senses, but that love, being a spirit, has other dimensions to it, and that those other dimensions work in a differential way, and that the integral cycle and the differential ecology work together to produce a complementarity that is like a 9th dimension. That the 4 dimensions of the integral space-time and the 4 dimensions of the ecology of consciousness when they are together, they generate a ninth dimension. The Hermetic treatise that was discovered in Nag Hammadi, its title was "The Eighth Reveals the Ninth." And if you read it in the translation, the ninth is a silence. It is an amplitude of a third field. It is not the field of nature. It is not the field of vision, of differential consciousness. It is a ninth dimension, third field of a silence within which one can hear singing from a 10th dimension. The ancient Hellenistic Jewish wisdom that passed into medieval Merkaba mysticism. Merkaba means the throne of God, chariot of God. God's throne extends from the 9th to the 10th heaven. And that in the 10th heaven, one receives a new kind of form that was hitherto not suspected whatsoever, a 10-dimensional form. And we've been talking for many of the series about Michio Kaku and string theory and M theory, F theory. And one of his great books about 10 years ago was called Hyperspace, The Explorations in the Math and Physics of 10 Dimensions. Hyperspace is a form, but is not a form that records in space-time, nor is it a form that records in conscious forms as well. The person, even a spiritual person, is a conscious form. The cosmos is the science infinite form, but the hyperspace as a form is outside of even the complementarity of the 9 dimensions. And so it's called a perfect 10th, the perfect 10. But the perfect 10, like hyperspace, 10-dimensional, string theory with M theory, and even refined, does not do the mathematical perfect completeness exactly. There is a slight discrepancy that proliferates and only vanishes when you move to 11 dimensions. If one could move to 11 dimensions, one would find the theory of everything. However, here's the conclusion to Kaku's Introduction to Superstrings and M Theory, the second edition. He had to correct and refine a number of things. At present, string theory and its recent reformulation, M theory, provides the most promising hope for a unified theory of all physical forces. Not only does string theory combine gravity with the other quantum forces, it is also rich enough in principle to explain all the symmetries, the pairs, found in nature. In this respect, the theory has no rivals. There are, however, a number of stringent tests that the theory must pass. The outstanding problem of string theory is to find the correct vacuum which describes our physical universe. Among the millions of vacua discovered in 4 dimensions, one must be found which can reproduce the standard model with symmetry coupled to gravity. Many of the marvelous properties of superstring theory come from local supersymmetry, but eventually supersymmetry must be broken if the theory is to describe the physical universe. So far, no convincing method has been proposed to yield supersymmetry breaking. here's the jujitsu of the high dharma. A hyperspace, because it is a form that exceeds everything except a supersymmetry. The cosmos itself at 8 dimensions will have a symmetry, and does. The 9th, which is the context for it, the energy brought to a supercelestial silence, so that one can at last hear and then see through recognition of a very high order, higher than high. Philo said, more pure than the one and more good than the monad. That 10-dimensional hyperspace has, as it were, to use a colloquial term, it generates an effect. And the effect is, in fact, an 11-dimensional field, but it records super symmetrically perfect as a 0 field that is nature. So that nature at once is a 0 field that begins the whole integral cycle of actuality and all of its developments to a universe. But that 0 nature field is secretly the 11-dimensional field itself. The Chinese term for it is Tao. The Buddhist term is Nirvana. The ancient Persian word for it was paradise. The quality that is there is that it isn't just simply that something has reached some kind of an end and then has a beginning, but that it is a super eternity. Because already the 8-dimensional cosmos is already what we would recognize as cosmic, which generates the complementarity with nature so that you have a discovery moment within space-time, and you have a recognition moment within the conscious ecology, and when they occur together tuned, one has what the Greek term for that is not a discovery but an epiphany, and when they're tuned perfectly, one calls that a theophany. The theophany is that one gets the super intuitive poignancy in hyperspace. That second generation from Pythagoras, not Parmenides and Diotima of Mantinea, but the next generation, which saw the beginnings of the life of people like Socrates and Euripides and Thucydides. But the geniuses that were working in classical Greece at that time, from the first generation that now in their old years produced art forms, you had the first presentation of a Greek tragedy by Aeschylus. The first tragedy was called The Persians. It's still extant. If you look at the structure of Greek tragedy, you will see that there is a strophe movement that goes to a certain threshold where it does not complete the ambit, but turns. The Greek term for that is metanoia. it turns, but in its turning, its dynamic goes back, weaving through in a counter way. The strophe, the stand, the turn, and the counter strophe. And that this pattern then, when it's danced and sung in Greek, is called a chorea. And the chorea is the form of the celebration of complementarity released into activity. So that the denouement of a Greek tragedy is that the tragedy is a tragedy of appearance in a cycle that is limited. But that the release is in a mystical superdimensionality that is not subject to the limited, is participatory in the unlimited. Apodictic in Greek. That quality in Greek tragedy, in Greek mystery initiation with dances and choruses, also appears in the poetry of Pindar. Pindar and Aeschylus were close friends, they contemporaries, and Pindar creates, for the first time in classical Greece, a lyric poetry that ostensibly is to celebrate the athletic excellence of competitors in games, the Olympian games, the Nemean games, the Pythian games, so Isthmian games. But the poesis of Pindar's Greek is to take the language that was already now complexified and put it into an acrobatic grammar. So when you go to try to translate Pindar from the Greek, almost nobody was able to really do it for a long time in English. And I remember it's about 40 some years ago buying C.M. Bora's great study of Pindar, and he said previous translations of Pindar read like somebody taking an eagle on a short little walk on a shorter leash. You don't get it that this is an eagle. This is not your pet little poochie. This is an eagle. You have to be able to, one of Steve Miller's most famous songs, Fly Like an Eagle. If you fly like an eagle, you learn something extraordinary, that great birds like that are not only free in themselves, they are free to pair, and very frequently very large birds will hunt together. Falcons and hawks hunt together. When eagles hunt together, they hunt together in exchanging. One will watch the nest, the other will hunt, come back, reverse. This kind of tuned, parried, acrobatic, which is part of the motion that now double transforms ritual. You no longer do the set things, or even the set things with variations and developments and modifications and reforms and revolutions and all of that. But there is a second, a distillation, that now makes that not just a modification, but a double transform, so that one comes out with a third form, a thrice greatest form. And that thrice greatest form is exactly where one comes to in the spirit person, realizing you have a physical form, you have a mental form, now you have a spiritual form. And all three of these are put into a harmonic by the form of the cosmos itself. But the cosmos itself, having been arrived at, because the second form, the mind form, in order to get to the spirit person, had to become transparent. Without transparency, everything stops with the mind. The mind pulls back then vision, thinking that it's a function of itself. This is called the inflation of the ego. It's called the arrogance of the self. Well, I did that. Look how good I am. I'm a titan. Well, titan, tell you something. You gotta clean the mirror to see that it's not a mirror. There's no silver on the back. It's not even a window. It's an openness. And it's not just that the frame is open, there's no frame. It's pure open. The old saying was, two Zen masters meeting each other, only the wind blew. There was no one there. The cosmos must become transparent. It must cease to limit itself to an electromagnetic spectrum for its calibration, and to accept that there is a complementarity of a magnetoelectric spectrum. If one were a physical being in the magnetoelectric spectrum with 20 billion times the frequency, you could walk through the universe and walk in between electrons and nucleuses and protons and neutrons together in a nucleus and never touch. It's the old Chuang-Tzu Zen master story. The emperor needs to have sacrifices of an ox, and the Chuang-Tzu Taoist comes with his knife, and he cuts up the ox for the sacrifice, and the knife is not the least bit dented or dulled. And the emperor says, well, how do you do that? These royal butchers use dozens of knives, which then they have to re-grind, and yours is just as pristine. And Chuang-Tzu Taoist says, well, their knives hit the bones and the sinews, go through the tissues. Mine doesn't touch anything, and so it's never in need of sharpening. It's that kind of a quality. When the electromagnetic and the magnetoelectric spectrums are together, a invisible, mysterious, transcendental energy occurs. But it occurs in such a way that it occurs as a complete, perfect zero, not a vacuum, but a fertile vacuum. It is a zero which can generate ones spontaneously, anytime, forever. It is a pregnant zero, so that nature has a feminine field quality. But because that feminine field quality is super wise, is called wisdom. It's called Sophia. It's called in the Mahayana, originally the name was the Lady Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. But was fertile in the sense of being able to give birth to females and males, both in that pairedness. So that the bodhisattva that came out from the Lady Prajnaparamita was Avalokiteshvara, who looks down with merciful compassion on the entirety, not only of the creation in the universe, but of the differential infinite capacities of it in the cosmos. Avalokiteshvara, though, can be represented either as a male or a female. Can be a male mother. Can be a female mother as well. the female version of Avalokiteshvara, when it went from India through Tibet into China, became Kuan Yin. The male version of Avalokiteshvara became the super celestial focus that the Dalai Lama inhabits in his lineage. It is a quality where the 11 dimensions simply do not record, and that it does not ever record is good news. More next week.